Staff Sergeant Jake Bulldog Murphy had seen a lot of weird stuff in his 23 years of military service, but nothing quite prepared him for the sight of 3 aliens arguing over whether human food qualified as actual cuisine or just elaborate biological warfare. He stood in the galley of the diplomatic vessel Harmony, watching through the viewport as Kepler's station grew larger, and wondered, not for the first time, how the hell he'd ended up as the cook for the first Galactic Culinary Summit. "Mercy," he muttered to himself while prepping vegetables for what would probably be the last decent meal he'd serve for a while. "You should have stayed in the infantry. At least bullets are straightforward." The Harmony docked with a metallic thunk that echoed through the ship's hull, and Jake could already hear the diplomatic chatter starting up in the main corridor. He'd been dreading this moment for weeks. 3 alien species, all convinced their food was the pinnacle of galactic sophistication, were about to descend on his kitchen like a pack of food critics with superiority complexes. First through the airlock came Keltar, the Vorthan food critic, whose species looked like 7-foot-tall praying mantises with an attitude problem. Everything about him screamed pretentious, from his elaborate ceremonial robes to the way he sniffed the air like he was already offended by what he might smell. His translator crackled to life as he spoke in rapid clicks and whistles. "Ah, the primitive human vessel. I can already detect the crude aromatics of their so-called cuisine. How quaint." Right behind him strutted Zephyr, a crystalline chef whose body literally sparkled like a living diamond. Her species had evolved from silicon-based minerals, which apparently made them think they were hot stuff in the kitchen. She moved with the kind of rigid precision that suggested she measured salt by the individual grain. "Keltar, please," she said in a voice like wind chimes being strangled. "We must not judge too harshly. After all, humans are still learning to crawl in the culinary arts. Perhaps in another 1,000 years, they'll discover seasoning." The final member of this charming trio was Bloxwin, a nebuloid who looked like a sentient purple cloud stuffed into a containment suit. His species consumed gases and energy, which made Jake wonder why the hell he was even here. But apparently, being a gourmand of the ethereal palate was a thing now. "My dear colleagues," Bloxwin wheezed through his translator, "I have reviewed the human dietary submissions. They appear to consume charred animal flesh and fermented plant matter. It's like watching children play with fire and calling it art." Jake's grip tightened on his knife. These 3 had been bad-mouthing human food for exactly 30 seconds, and he was already calculating how many ways he could prepare them for dinner. But he was a professional, damn it. He'd served in combat zones, diplomatic missions, and, once memorably, a 3-week stint cooking for a group of senators who complained about everything. He could handle 3 alien food snobs. The station's commanding officer, a tired-looking woman named Captain Rodriguez, was giving the standard welcome speech about cultural exchange and mutual understanding. Jake tuned it out. He'd heard it all before, during the briefings. What he hadn't been prepared for was the casual way these aliens dismissed everything his species had ever cooked. "I understand humans are particularly fond of something called pizza," Keltar was saying to his companions, mandibles clicking in what Jake assumed was amusement. "Flat bread covered in bacterial cultures and the secretions of domesticated mammals. Fascinating from an anthropological perspective." "And they're hamburgers," Zafara added with a crystalline laugh that sounded like glass breaking. "Processed meat compressed into geometric shapes. So, primitive." Bloxwin's purple mist swirled with what looked like excitement. "I've heard they consume something called hot dogs that aren't actually made from canines. The deception is almost artistic in its crudeness." Jake had been in enough firefights to know when to pick his battles, but these 3 were pushing every button he had. His grandmother's marinara sauce was not primitive, his pulled pork wasn't crude, and his famous chili, the one that had won the base cook-off 3 years running, was sure as hell not biological warfare. But he kept his mouth shut and his knife moving, because that's what Marines did. They endured, they adapted, and when the time was right, they struck back. He just didn't know yet that his moment was coming sooner than expected. The formal presentations began 3 hours later in Kepler Station's main conference hall, a sterile chrome amphitheater that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never actually eaten food. Jake stood at the back with the other human delegation, watching as each alien species prepared to showcase what they considered the pinnacle of galactic cuisine. Captain Rodriguez had insisted he attend for cultural context, which Jake translated as, "so you can watch them insult everything you've ever cooked." He'd changed into his dress uniform for the occasion, complete with the service ribbons that reminded him of better times, when his biggest worry was dodging plasma fire, not pretentious food critics. Keltar went first, naturally. The Vorthan approached the central platform with the kind of theatrical flair that made Jake want to throw something. His presentation included holographic displays, ambient lighting, and what sounded like a full orchestra of clicking mandibles. "Behold," Keltar announced, gesturing toward a series of translucent cubes that jiggled like nervous jello, "the essence of enlightenment. Each morsel contains 17 different dimensions of flavor, carefully balanced to achieve perfect harmony with the consumer's neural pathways. One does not simply eat this cuisine, one experiences transcendence." Jake squinted at the cubes. They looked like something he'd scrape off the bottom of his boot after a long patrol. But the other aliens were making appreciative noises, so apparently gelatinous mystery meat was haute cuisine in some circles. "The preparation," Keltar continued, "requires 47 hours of meditation, precise temperature control to within 0.001 degrees, and a blessed saliva of our most enlightened monks. Humans, of course, would never understand such sophistication." That little dig earned chuckles from the alien audience. Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. He'd heard worse from drill sergeants who actually knew what they were talking about. Next came Zephyra, who approached her presentation like she was conducting a symphony made of math. Her cuisine consisted of perfectly geometric crystals that chimed when touched, each one supposedly containing compressed nutrients arranged in harmonic frequencies. "Observe," she said, her voice ringing like a tuning fork, "the crystalline convergence. Each structure represents the perfect fusion of sustenance and artistry. The flavors exist in quantum superposition until the moment of consumption, when they collapse into a symphony of taste that resonates with the very fabric of existence." The crystals were pretty, Jake had to admit. They looked like fancy jewelry. But calling them food was like calling a calculator a gourmet meal. Still, the alien delegates were practically swooning over the revolutionary approach to nutritional aesthetics. "Such precision," Zephyra added with what Jake was pretty sure was a smug expression, "requires centuries of training and an understanding of molecular harmony that primitive species simply cannot grasp. Humans, for instance, still believe that cooking involves applying heat to organic matter. How delightfully archaic." More alien laughter. Jake's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He'd been applying heat to organic matter for 20 years, and he'd never had a single complaint from anyone who wasn't a pretentious crystal person with a superiority complex. Finally, Bloxwin took the stage, if you could call it that. The nebuloid's presentation involved releasing colorful gas clouds that swirled and danced in the air like psychedelic fog. The audience inhaled deeply, and their expressions shifted to something approaching religious ecstasy. "The ethereal banquet," Bloxwin intoned, his purple mist pulsing with each word, "is cuisine unbound by the crude limitations of physical form. These flavor clouds contain the essence of taste itself, liberated from the barbaric necessity of mastication and digestion. One simply breathes and achieves perfect nourishment." The gases smelled like a combination of flowers and ozone, with undertones that Jake couldn't identify but somehow made him think of his childhood summers. He had to admit, it was impressive. It was also completely insane. "This represents," Bloxwin continued, "the ultimate evolution of culinary art. While lesser species remain trapped in their primitive traditions of solid food and cooking fires, we have ascended to pure gustatory enlightenment. Humans, bless their simple hearts, still gather around flames like their cave-dwelling ancestors. So wonderfully nostalgic." That did it. The cave-dwelling crap was bad enough, but it was the patronizing tone that pushed Jake over the edge. He'd eaten MREs in foxholes, cooked for generals and privates alike, and learned recipes from his grandmother that had been passed down through 4 generations of Marines. These 3 space cases had just spent an hour calling everything his species had ever cooked primitive, barbaric, and archaic. Jake stepped forward, his voice cutting through the polite applause like a drill sergeant's whistle. "With all due respect to our distinguished guests, I'd like to respectfully disagree with that assessment." The hall fell silent. Captain Rodriguez looked like she was about to have a heart attack. The alien delegates turned to stare at the human who dared to interrupt their celebration of superior cuisine. "Staff Sergeant Murphy," Rodriguez hissed under her breath, "what are you doing?" Jake ignored her. His eyes were locked on the 3 aliens who just spent the last hour insulting everything he'd ever cooked. "I'm formally challenging these fine chefs to a cook-off. Winner takes all. Let's see how enlightened and harmonious and ethereal your food really is when it's going head-to-head with some good old-fashioned human cooking." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then Queltar started clicking his mandibles in what Jake really hoped was laughter, and not a declaration of war. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward with the kind of forced smile that usually preceded someone getting court-martialed. Staff Sergeant Murphy was just expressing his enthusiasm for cultural exchange. Perhaps we should move on to the scheduled diplomatic— No, Queltar interrupted, his mandibles clicking faster now. This is fascinating. The human believes he can compete with species who have perfected culinary arts for millennia. How delightfully naive. Zafara's crystalline form sparkled with what Jake was pretty sure was amusement. It would be educational, wouldn't it? A practical demonstration of the evolutionary gap between sophisticated cuisine and primitive sustenance preparation. Block's wind swirled with excitement. Oh, this is too rich to pass up. Like watching a child challenge a master artist to a painting contest. The entertainment value alone would justify the time investment. Jake felt his eye twitch. Being patronized by a sentient cloud was not how he'd planned to spend his afternoon, but here they were. So that's a yes then? You're accepting my challenge? With great pleasure, Queltar replied, his translator somehow managing to convey smugness. Though I feel obligated to warn you that Vorthan Cuisine has won the Galactic Gastronomy Awards for the past 3 centuries running. And crystalline molecular harmony techniques, Zafara added, are taught in the finest culinary academies across 17 star systems. While my ethereal gastronomy, Bloxwin wheezed, has been declared a universal art form by the Council of Civilized Worlds. Jake nodded slowly. That's real impressive. I learned to cook from my grandmother and a bunch of Marines who thought Tabasco sauce was a food group. More alien laughter. Captain Rodriguez looked like she was seriously considering whether court-martialing Jake would be worse than the diplomatic incident he was about to create. Perhaps, she said carefully, we should discuss the parameters of this friendly competition. I'm sure Staff Sergeant Murphy didn't mean to imply any serious challenge to our esteemed guest's culinary expertise. Oh, but I did, Jake said, his voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that made smart people nervous. Dead serious. These 3 think human food is primitive? Let's put it to the test. The station's administrative officer, a nervous-looking man named Director Fleming, cleared his throat. Well, I suppose we could arrange access to the station's main kitchen facility. It's designed to accommodate multiple species' dietary requirements, and has all the necessary equipment for— Excellent, Queltar interrupted, though I must say I feel somewhat guilty about this. It's like challenging a Stone Age hunter to a philosophy debate. Jake's smile didn't reach his eyes. Don't you worry about me, bug boy. I'll manage just fine. The translation matrix apparently had trouble with bug boy because Queltar's mandibles stopped clicking for a moment. Then he made a sound that might have been laughter, or might have been the alien equivalent of cracking knuckles. Very well, primitive human. What are your terms? Jake had been in enough bar fights to know when to double down. Simple. Each of us prepares a meal for the other species present. Best food wins. Loser admits their cuisine isn't as superior as they claimed. And who judges this contest? Zafara asked, her crystalline form taking on a sharper edge. The station personnel, Jake replied. Neutral parties. No politics, no preconceptions. Just honest opinions about which food tastes better. Blox's mist pulsed with what looked like excitement. This is perfect. A public demonstration of culinary evolution in action. The historical significance alone. 3 hours, Director Fleming said, consulting his tablet. That's when the main kitchen will be available. Will that be sufficient preparation time? Jake shrugged. I can cook a decent meal in 30 minutes. 3 hours should be plenty. 30 minutes? Queltar's mandibles clicked rapidly. My essence of enlightenment requires a minimum of 47 hours of meditation and preparation. How can you possibly create anything worthwhile in 30 minutes? That's what we're about to find out, Jake said. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of logistics and Jake questioning his life choices. He'd requested access to the station's personnel files to research alien dietary requirements and biological restrictions. Turns out Vorthings could digest most organic proteins but were sensitive to certain acids. Crystallines required specific mineral content in their food but could process complex carbohydrates, and nebuloids, despite their gaseous nature, could actually consume solid food if it was properly prepared for their unique digestive system. Jake spent the time studying biochemistry charts and muttering increasingly creative curses under his breath. He'd challenged 3 master chefs to a cooking contest using ingredients he'd never heard of, for species whose dietary needs he'd learned about 20 minutes ago. Either this was going to be the greatest comeback in culinary history, or he was about to become the first human to start an interstellar war over dinner. "Murphy," he told himself while reviewing the station's ingredient inventory, "you've cooked for Marines, senators, and that one time for the president's nephew who was allergic to everything. You've got this." He just hoped his grandmother's recipes were as adaptable as he thought they were. The kitchen facility turned out to be massive, with separate preparation areas for different atmospheric requirements and enough equipment to supply a small army. Jake walked through it like he was conducting a reconnaissance mission, noting the location of every pot, pan, and thermal regulator. His 3 opponents were already there, each setting up their own elaborate preparation stations. Keltar had brought what looked like a portable meditation chamber. Zephyra was arranging crystalline instruments with mathematical precision. Bloxwin was calibrating some kind of gas mixing apparatus that looked like it belonged in a chemistry lab. Jake rolled up his sleeves and started organizing his workspace with military efficiency. He'd decided on his menu during the research phase. 3 classic dishes, adapted for alien biology. It was either going to be brilliant or catastrophic. "Ready when you are, gentlemen," he called out, not bothering to look up from his prep work. The contest was about to begin, and Jake Bulldog Murphy was either going to prove that human cuisine deserved respect, or he was going to fail spectacularly in front of half the galaxy. Either way, it was going to be interesting. Director Fleming raised his hand like he was starting a race. "Chefs, you have 3 hours. Begin, now." Jake's opponents immediately launched into their elaborate rituals. Keltar sealed himself in his meditation chamber, mandibles clicking in what sounded like ancient Vorthan chants. Zephyra began arranging her crystalline instruments in complex geometric patterns, each placement calculated to the millimeter. Bloxwin started mixing gases with the precision of a mad scientist, purple mist swirling around his containment suit. Jake cracked his knuckles and got to work. "Look at him." Keltar's voice drifted from his meditation chamber, translator crackling with amusement. "He's just chopping vegetables. No ceremony, no spiritual preparation. How wonderfully primitive." "Observe the crude technique," Zephyra added, her crystalline form sparkling as she calibrated her molecular harmonizer. "Random cuts, inconsistent sizes. There's no mathematical precision to his methodology." Jake ignored them and kept working. First dish, spaghetti carbonara, adapted for Vorthan biology. The trick was going to be the eggs. Vorthans couldn't process the proteins properly, but Jake had found a substitute in the station's stores. Quellian bird eggs had a similar protein structure but with amino acid chains that Vorthan digestive systems could handle. He started by rendering down some fatty pork belly he'd found in the human supplies, letting it crisp up while he prepped his pasta. The station's food fabricator could produce something close to spaghetti, but Jake had learned long ago that fresh pasta made all the difference. He mixed flour with the Quellian eggs, a splash of olive oil and a pinch of salt, then started kneading the dough with the kind of methodical rhythm that came from years of practice. "Is he making his own pasta?" Bloxwin's mist paused mid-swirl. "From scratch? How inefficient." "Barbarically time-consuming," Keltar agreed. "Why not simply synthesize the optimal nutritional matrix directly?" Jake rolled out the pasta dough, cut it into perfect strands, and dropped it into boiling salted water. The key to carbonara was timing. Everything had to come together at exactly the right moment or the eggs would scramble. He'd made this dish 1,000 times, but never for a 7-foot-tall space mantis who thought human food was primitive slop. While the pasta cooked, Jake prepped his second dish, a deconstructed sugar sculpture for Zephyra. Crystallines required specific mineral content, and their unique physiology meant they literally incorporated consumed minerals into their body structure. Jake had found a way to create edible crystals using crystallized sugars, trace minerals, and a technique he'd learned from a pastry chef in Paris during his last leave. He heated sugar to the hard crack stage, then added carefully measured amounts of calcium carbonate, magnesium sulfate, and trace elements that would complement Zephyra's silicon-based biology. The trick was getting the crystalline structure right. Too much heat and it would be amorphous. Too little and it wouldn't set properly. "What is he doing now?" Zephyra's voice carried a note of confusion. "That appears to be crystal formation, but the technique is completely unorthodox." Jake poured the molten sugar mixture into specially designed molds, creating intricate geometric shapes that would fracture and release different flavors as they dissolved. Each crystal was designed to provide both the minerals Zephyra needed and a progression of tastes that would complement her species' unique sensory experience. Impossible, Zephyru muttered. He's creating harmonic resonance structures without any understanding of quantum crystallography. It shouldn't work. But it was working. The crystals were forming exactly as Jake had calculated, their internal structure creating the kind of light refraction patterns that would appeal to crystalline aesthetic sensibilities. His third dish was the real challenge, molecular gastronomy for Bloxwyn. Nebuloids existed in a gaseous state most of the time, which meant their food needed to be something they could consume in their natural form. Jake had found a way to create edible clouds using a technique he'd learned from watching cooking shows during long deployment nights. He took a rich chicken stock, reduced it down to concentrate the flavors, then used liquid nitrogen to create tiny flavor pearls that would burst and release aromatic compounds when consumed. The pearls were suspended in an edible gel matrix that would dissolve at body temperature, creating the effect of tasting solid food while maintaining the gaseous consumption method nebuloids preferred. That's actually quite ingenious, Bloxwyn's mist swirled with what looked like surprise. He's creating a dual-phase consumption experience. The theoretical framework is sound, but the execution should be impossible without proper equipment. Jake was using kitchen tools and chemistry techniques he'd picked up from years of creative problem-solving. A whipped cream dispenser became a molecular gastronomy tool. Liquid nitrogen from the station's medical supplies became a flash freezing agent. A standard immersion blender became a homogenizer for creating stable emulsions. Meanwhile, his opponents were deep in their elaborate preparation rituals. Keltar's meditation chamber was humming with harmonic frequencies that supposedly aligned his spiritual energy with the cosmic forces of flavor. Zephyra was conducting what looked like a symphony of crystalline instruments, each one tuned to create specific molecular vibrations. Bloxwyn was mixing gases with the precision of a master perfumer, creating clouds that swirled with hypnotic patterns. The human seems to be enjoying himself, Keltar observed, his mandibles clicking with puzzlement. Jake was in fact enjoying himself. This was what he'd been trained for, adapting to impossible circumstances, making do with limited resources, and finding creative solutions to problems that shouldn't have solutions. He'd cooked for generals with impossible dietary restrictions, Marines with no taste buds, and once, memorably, for a group of foreign dignitaries who couldn't eat anything that had been within 50 feet of peanuts. 3 alien food critics, this was just another day at the office. By the 2-hour mark, Jake had his carbonara sauce at the perfect consistency, his sugar crystals cooling in their molds and his molecular gastronomy spheres forming in perfect suspension. The kitchen was filled with aromas that shouldn't have worked together but somehow did. The rich, smoky smell of rendered pork, the clean sweetness of crystallized sugar, and the complex savory notes of concentrated chicken stock. "I don't understand," Zephyra said, her crystalline form flickering with confusion. "His techniques are completely unrefined, but the aromatic compounds are actually quite sophisticated. The molecular structures he's creating shouldn't be stable," Bloxwyn added, his purple mist swirling with agitation. "He's using primitive equipment to achieve results that should require advanced technology." Jake plated his first dish with the kind of precision that came from years of serving food to people who noticed everything. The carbonara went into a bowl that had been warmed to exactly the right temperature. The pasta was perfectly al dente, coated in a sauce that clung to each strand without being heavy. He garnished it with fresh cracked black pepper and a sprinkle of grated cheese that he'd aged in the station's environmental systems for just the right flavor profile. "Time!" Director Fleming called out. Jake stepped back from his station, wiping his hands on his apron. His 3 dishes were perfectly plated, each one adapted for its intended alien consumer but unmistakably human in its approach. No meditation chambers, no crystalline instruments, no gas-mixing apparatus, just good food, made with skill and a lot of creative problem-solving. His opponents were still frantically finishing their preparations. Keltar's gelatinous cubes were trembling in their containment fields. Zephyra's crystals were singing with harmonic frequencies. Bloxwyn's gas clouds were swirling in complex patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Well," Jake said, pulling off his apron, "I guess we're about to find out if all that enlightenment and transcendence tastes as good as it sounds." The real test was about to begin. The main conference hall had been transformed into an impromptu dining room, with tables arranged for the various species present. Jake counted at least 30 station personnel who'd gathered to witness what was already being called the most important meal in galactic history by the overly dramatic communications officer. Director Fleming stood at the center podium, looking like a man who'd signed up to manage a space station and somehow ended up hosting an interstellar cooking competition. "Ladies, gentlemen, and esteemed beings, We'll now begin the tasting portion of our cultural exchange. Each chef will present their creations to our volunteer judges. Jake wheeled out his cart first, the 3 dishes arranged with military precision. He'd spent 20 minutes making sure everything was at optimal serving temperature and properly garnished. The carbonara steamed gently in its warmed bowl, the sugar crystals caught the light like tiny prisms, and the molecular gastronomy spheres floated in their edible gel matrix like alien caviar. "Staff Sergeant Murphy," Fleming announced, "please present your first dish." Jake cleared his throat and picked up the carbonara. "This is for our Vorthan guest. It's a classic human dish called spaghetti carbonara, adapted for your biology. The eggs are from Quellian birds, which have the amino acid profile your digestive system can process. The pork has been rendered to remove the acid compounds that cause you problems, and the pasta is made from grain that's been pre-treated to enhance flavor absorption." He set the bowl in front of Keltar, who stared at it like it might explode. The other Vorthans in the audience were clicking their mandibles in what sounded like nervous laughter. It's just noodles," Keltar said, his translator crackling with confusion. "Where's the spiritual preparation? The harmonic resonance? The 47 hours of meditation?" "Try it," Jake said simply. Keltar lifted a strand of pasta with the kind of caution usually reserved for defusing bombs. He placed it in his mouth, chewed thoughtfully, and then froze. His mandibles stopped clicking entirely. His compound eyes widened to the size of dinner plates. "This is," he started, then stopped. He took another bite, larger this time, then another. "This is impossible. The flavor complexity. It's building in layers. First the richness of the rendered fat, then the protein structure breaking down into individual amino components, then..." He paused, mandibles trembling. "Then there's something else. Something I can't identify." "Love," Jake said. "My grandmother always said the secret ingredient was love, plus a hell of a lot of black pepper." Keltar was eating faster now, his earlier composure completely gone. "The texture is perfect. The temperature gradient creates a thermal flavor cascade that..." He stopped eating and looked up at Jake. "How did you know to adjust the pH balance for optimal Vorthon digestion?" "I read your medical files," Jake replied, "figured out what you needed and worked backward from there." You studied our biology?" Keltar's mandibles clicked in what Jake was starting to recognize as shock. "In 3 hours? Barry couldn't cook for you if I didn't understand how your system worked." The bowl was nearly empty now. Keltar was scraping the bottom with his utensil, trying to get every last drop of sauce. Around the hall, other Vorthans were staring at their supposedly sophisticated food critic with expressions of disbelief. "This is..." Keltar's voice was barely a whisper. "This is the most emotionally complex flavor profile I've ever experienced. It's not just food. It's a story, a narrative told through taste and texture." Jake moved to his second dish. "This one's for Zephyra. It's a crystalline sugar sculpture, designed to complement your silicon-based biology. Each crystal contains the mineral content you need, but arranged in a way that creates flavor progression as it dissolves." He placed the elaborate sugar structure in front of Zephyra, who examined it with the kind of intensity usually reserved for mathematical proofs. The crystals were arranged in a complex geometric pattern, each one refracting light in different directions to create rainbow patterns across the table. "The mathematical precision is actually quite impressive," she admitted reluctantly. "But it's just sugar, crystallized glucose with mineral additives. Where's the quantum harmonics, the molecular resonance frequencies?" "Taste it," Jake said. Zephyra picked up one of the smaller crystals and placed it against her crystalline lips. Jake watched as it began to dissolve, releasing its mineral content into her system. Her entire body began to glow with a soft, warm light. "Oh," she said, her voice taking on a harmonic quality Jake had never heard before. "Oh my!" She reached for another crystal, this one larger and more complex. As it dissolved, her glow intensified, and Jake could swear he heard her body ringing like a bell. "This is extraordinary," she whispered. "The mineral content is perfectly balanced for my physiology, but the dissolution rate... It's creating a temporal flavor experience. Each crystal releases its components at different rates, creating a symphony of taste that builds over time." She was eating faster now, her crystalline form pulsing with light as each new mineral was absorbed. "The iron content supports my structural integrity, the silicon enhances my optical properties, the calcium creates harmonic resonance in my auditory systems. But how did you know to sequence them in this order?" "Trial and error," Jake said, plus some basic chemistry. I figured if you're made of crystals, you'd want food that worked with your natural structure instead of against it. This is... Zephyra's voice was pure harmony now, like listening to a choir made of wind chimes. This is the most perfect integration of form and function I've ever experienced. It's not just feeding my body, it's making me more than I was. The other crystallines in the audience were staring at their representative with expressions of awe. Zephyra was literally glowing, brighter than Jake had ever seen her, her crystalline form casting rainbow patterns across the entire hall. "This is impossible," she said, reaching for another crystal. "I can feel my molecular structure optimizing in real time. The flavor isn't just taste, it's structural enhancement, it's evolution through consumption." Jake moved to his final dish, the molecular gastronomy creation for Bloxwin. The edible gel matrix shimmered with suspended flavor pearls, each one designed to burst and release aromatic compounds when consumed. "This one's for you, Bloxwin. It's designed for gaseous consumption, but it maintains the structural complexity of solid food. The flavor pearls will dissolve at your body temperature and release compounds that you can absorb directly." He placed the dish in front of Bloxwin, who stared at it with what Jake assumed was skepticism. The purple mist swirled around his containment suit as he considered the offering. It's solid food," Bloxwin said. "How am I supposed to consume solid matter in my natural state?" "Trust the process," Jake said. Bloxwin extended a tendril of purple mist toward the dish. The moment it made contact, the gel matrix began to dissolve, releasing flavor pearls that burst into aromatic clouds. The effect was immediate and dramatic. What is this?" Bloxwin's voice was filled with wonder as the flavor clouds merged with his gaseous form. "I can taste it, but I'm not eating it. I'm breathing flavor." The first wave of taste hit him, and his purple mist began to swirl in complex patterns. Chicken stock, but concentrated, intensified. The protein molecules are breaking down into individual amino acids, each one carrying a different flavor component. Another wave, and his mist began to glow with internal light. Herbs, multiple varieties, each one releasing compounds at different rates. Thyme, rosemary, sage, but they're interacting with each other, creating flavor combinations that shouldn't be possible. "That's the beauty of molecular gastronomy," Jake explained. "You can create eating experiences that wouldn't exist naturally. The flavors are designed to build and interact over time." Bloxwin was completely absorbed now, his entire being swirling around the dissolving dish. This is transcendence. Real transcendence. Not the pretentious philosophical nonsense I usually spout, but actual elevation of the sensory experience beyond normal parameters. The flavor pearls were releasing in waves, each one perfectly timed to complement the others. Jake watched as Bloxwin's mist grew brighter and more complex, developing new colors and patterns with each burst of flavor. "I can feel the molecular structure of each component," Bloxwin said, his voice filled with reverence. "The way they're designed to interact with my gaseous form. It's like you understood my biology better than I do." "I just read the manual," Jake said, "figured out what you needed and built the food around it." "The manual?" Bloxwin's mist paused mid-swirl. "You mean the standard nebuloid physiological documentation? That dry, technical listing of our basic biological functions?" "Yeah, pretty thorough, actually. Once I understood how your digestive system worked, the rest was just chemistry." By now, word was spreading through the hall. Station personnel were gathering around the alien representatives, watching in amazement as 3 of the galaxy's most pretentious food critics were reduced to emotional wrecks by human cooking. Keltar was still scraping his bowl, trying to get every last drop of carbonara sauce. Zephyra was glowing like a miniature sun, her crystalline form more beautiful than Jake had ever seen it. Bloxwin had absorbed his entire dish and was swirling in patterns that looked like joy made visible. "This is impossible," Queltar said, looking up from his empty bowl. "This level of flavor complexity should require decades of training and spiritual preparation." "This structural optimization," Zephyra added, her voice still ringing with harmonic frequencies, "should require advanced quantum crystallography and molecular engineering." "This sensory transcendence," Bloxwin concluded, his mist pulsing with new colors, "should require ethereal gastronomy techniques that take centuries to master." Jake shrugged. "I just cooked food that would taste good to you, used ingredients that worked with your biology instead of against it. It's not rocket science." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of other station personnel demanding to try the alien dishes. But after tasting Jake's adaptations, the elaborate presentations from his opponents seemed lacking. The gelatinous cubes tasted like nothing. The crystalline structures were pretty but flavorless. The gas clouds were aromatic but provided no real satisfaction. It was becoming clear that the contest was over, and Jake had won more decisively than anyone had expected. The formal judging was almost anticlimactic. Station personnel took turns sampling both the alien dishes and Jake's adaptations, and the results were so one-sided that Director Fleming didn't even bother with a formal vote count. The gelatinous cubes were politely described as texturally interesting. The crystalline structures were visually impressive but nutritionally vacant. The gas clouds were aromatic but ultimately unsatisfying. Jake's dishes, on the other hand, had created what the station's medical officer described as the most positive biological responses I've ever recorded from interspecies food consumption. But the real victory wasn't in the judging. It was in watching three of the galaxy's most arrogant food critics come to terms with the fact that they'd been schooled by a Marine who'd learned to cook from his grandmother, and a bunch of enlisted men who thought hot sauce was a vegetable. Keltar was the first to break. He stood up from his table, his elaborate robes rustling as he approached Jake, with the kind of careful dignity that suggested he was trying very hard not to completely lose his composure. "Staff Sergeant Murphy," he said, his mandibles clicking in what Jake was learning to recognize as humility. "I owe you an apology. A significant one." "No need," Jake replied, wiping down his hands with a kitchen towel. "You were just working with what you knew." "No, you don't understand." Keltar's compound eyes were fixed on Jake with laser intensity. "I have spent 3 centuries studying the culinary arts. I have tasted the finest foods from 17 different star systems. I have written definitive treatises on flavor theory and gastronomy, philosophy, and in all that time, I have never experienced anything remotely comparable to what you just fed me." He gestured toward his empty bowl with something approaching reverence. That carbonara wasn't just food, it was a conversation, a dialogue between chef and consumer that spoke directly to my genetic memory. I could taste the history of your species in every bite, the struggle, the adaptation, the creativity born from necessity. Jake shifted uncomfortably. He'd been prepared for alien arrogance, diplomatic incidents, and possibly having to fight his way out of the station. He hadn't been prepared for poetic testimonials about his grandmother's recipe. "It's just pasta," he said. "No," Keltar said firmly. "It's not just pasta. It's proof that we've been thinking about cuisine entirely wrong. We've been so focused on complexity and sophistication that we forgot the most important element: connection. Your food created a connection between us that transcends species barriers." Zafara approached next, her crystalline form still glowing with residual energy from Jake's sugar sculptures. She moved with a fluidity that Jake had never seen before, as if his mineral-enhanced crystals had somehow optimized her entire motor system. "I must also apologize," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself seem to sing. "I called your techniques primitive, but they were actually the most advanced form of nutritional engineering I've ever encountered." "Advanced?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "I just mixed sugar with some minerals." "You created a time-grable nutritional matrix that enhanced my cellular structure while providing optimal flavor progression," Zafara explained. "The mathematical precision required to calculate the dissolution rates, the mineral interactions, the sensory sequencing, it should have taken supercomputers and decades of research." "I used a candy thermometer and some basic chemistry," Jake said. "Exactly." Zafara's glow intensified. "You achieved perfect results, using simple tools and intuitive understanding. That's not primitive, that's genius. True mastery of any art form isn't about having the most sophisticated equipment. It's about understanding the fundamental principles so deeply that you can work miracles with basic materials." Bloxwin was the last to approach, his purple mist swirling in patterns that Jake was pretty sure indicated deep contemplation. The nebuloid's gaseous form had taken on new colors and textures since consuming the molecular gastronomy dish, and he seemed somehow more substantial than before. "Staff Sergeant Murphy," Bloxwin said, his voice carrying undertones that Jake had never heard before. "What you have accomplished today goes far beyond cuisine. You have demonstrated something that I believed was impossible." "Which is?" "You made me feel solid," Bloxwin said simply. "For the first time in my existence, I experienced the sensation of having substance, of being more than just dispersed particles held together by electromagnetic fields. Your food didn't just nourish my body. It gave me a sense of being real." Jake looked around the hall at the gathering crowd. Station personnel were still buzzing with excitement, discussing the implications of what they'd witnessed. The other alien representatives were approaching with expressions of curiosity rather than condescension. Even Captain Rodriguez looked impressed, though she was clearly trying to maintain her diplomatic composure. "I think," Keltar said, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully, "we need to completely revise our understanding of what constitutes advanced cuisine." "Agreed," Zephyra chimed in. "The Galactic Culinary Council should establish an exchange program. We have much to learn from human techniques." "More than that," Bloxwin added, his mists swirling with enthusiasm. "We should move the annual Galactic Gastronomy Summit to Earth. Let human chefs teach us what we've been missing." Jake held up his hands. "Whoa, hold on there. I'm just one guy with a set of knives and some family recipes. I'm not representing all of human cuisine." "But you are," Keltar insisted. "Don't you see? What you've demonstrated isn't just individual skill. It's a fundamental approach to food that your entire species shares. You cook with intuition, with emotion, with the desire to nourish and connect. That's why your food creates such profound experiences." "We've been approaching cuisine as an intellectual exercise," Zephyra added. "Mathematical precision, technological enhancement, theoretical frameworks. But you showed us that the most important ingredient isn't something you can measure or synthesize. Care," Bloxwin said simply. "You cooked with care. Not just technical skill, but genuine concern for our well-being, our enjoyment, our unique needs. That's what made the difference." Director Fleming approached with a tablet full of what looked like official documentation. "Staff Sergeant Murphy, I've just received authorization from Earth Command to offer you a permanent position as Cultural Culinary Liaison for the Galactic Diplomatic Corps. The pay grade is significantly higher than your current rank, and you'd be responsible for developing interspecies cuisine programs across the galaxy." Jake stared at the tablet. "You want me to cook for aliens, professionally?" "We want you to teach the galaxy what human cuisine can accomplish," Fleming corrected. "Based on what I've seen today, you might be the key to better interspecies relations than any treaty we've ever signed." Jake looked around the hall again. Keltar was still glowing with the satisfaction of a truly great meal. Zephyra was literally sparkling with enhanced crystalline structure. Bloxwin's mist was swirling in patterns that looked like happiness made visible. Station personnel were already making requests for him to cook for their own species. Even the other alien representatives were approaching with expressions of curiosity rather than the condescension he'd grown accustomed to. "You know what?" Jake said, grinning for the first time since this whole thing started. "Why the hell not? But I've got conditions." "Name them," Fleming said. "First, I want a proper kitchen, not some sterile laboratory. A real kitchen with gas burners, cast iron pans, and enough space to work without bumping into meditation chambers." "Done." "Second, I want access to ingredients from Earth. Real ingredients, not synthesized approximations. If I'm going to teach the galaxy about human cuisine, I'm going to need proper supplies." "Absolutely." "Third," Jake's grin widened, "I want to bring my grandmother's recipe collection. If we're going to change galactic cuisine, we might as well do it right." The three alien food critics exchanged glances. Keltar was the first to speak. "Staff Sergeant Murphy, Jake, would you be willing to share those recipes with us? We would be honored to learn from your family's culinary traditions." Jake considered this for a moment. 3 hours ago, these same beings had been calling human food primitive slop and biological warfare. Now they were asking to learn from his grandmother's collection of handwritten recipe cards. "Tell you what," he said finally, "I'll teach you everything I know about human cooking, but in return, you've got to promise me something." "Anything," Zephyra said immediately. "No more calling food primitive just because it's simple. No more thinking that complicated means better. And for the love of all that's holy, no more meditation chambers in the kitchen. Food is supposed to bring people together, not separate them into spiritual categories." "Agreed," all three aliens said in unison. Jake nodded and looked around the hall one more time. An hour ago, he'd been just another enlisted cook on a diplomatic mission. Now, he was apparently the galaxy's first interspecies culinary ambassador, with 3 former food snobs as his first students. "You know," he said to no one in particular, "my grandmother always said that cooking was just another way of taking care of people. Turns out she was right about that, too." He paused, then added with the kind of satisfaction that came from a job well done, "She was also right about the secret ingredient being love. Though in this case, I think a healthy dose of 'screw you, I'll show you' didn't hurt either." The laughter that followed was universal, requiring no translation. Some things, Jake realized, really were the same across all species. And apparently good food was one of them.